Man of the people, champion of the common man, the president who opened the White House doors to ordinary Americans and fought against the elite banking establishment. Andrew Jackson stands in American mythology as the ultimate populist hero, the self-made frontiersman who rose from poverty to the presidency, who spoke for farmers and workers against the privileged few. We celebrate him as the embodiment of American democracy, the rough-hewn warrior who proved that anyone could achieve greatness in this nation. His face stares out from every $20 bill, his name graces cities and streets and even a state capitol. His legacy is taught as proof that America rewards hard work and determination. But there's a body count that never makes it into the heroic narrative. 4,000 Cherokee people dead, at least 4,000. Some historians estimate as many as 8,000. Men, women, children, infants, forced to march 1,000 miles at gunpoint through one of the coldest winters on record, dying of starvation, disease, and exposure along a path so littered with graves they called it the Trail of Tears. Entire families buried in unmarked graves along roadsides, denied even proper funerals because soldiers forced them to keep moving at bayonet point. And Andrew Jackson, the man of the people, the champion of democracy, the hero of New Orleans, orchestrated this forced removal not out of military necessity or national defense, but because white settlers wanted Cherokee land, because that land contained gold, because removing 50,000 indigenous people would open 25 million acres for white settlement and cotton cultivation, because genocide was profitable, and slavery. Over 300 people enslaved by Andrew Jackson and his family during his lifetime. But Jackson didn't inherit a plantation from wealthy parents the way Washington or Jefferson or Madison did. He was born into poverty, orphaned by 14, started with absolutely nothing. He built his fortune from the ground up by actively buying and selling human beings as a slave trader, operating in the Mississippi River Valley, by beating enslaved people who disobeyed, by hunting down those who escaped and dragging them back in chains to serve as examples. He didn't just own people, he trafficked them for profit. He speculated in human flesh the way other men speculated in land or cotton, buying low in one market, transporting people hundreds of miles down the river and selling high in another. And he did it all while presenting himself publicly as a man who understood struggle, who spoke for the powerless, who championed those left behind by America's corrupt elite. The contradiction isn't a footnote to Jackson's greatness. It's the foundation of his fortune. The man of the people built his wealth on genocide and slavery. The champion of democracy denied basic humanity to tens of thousands of people whose only crime was existing on land he wanted or having skin darker than his. That fortune, worth over $132 million in today's money, came directly from policies and practices so brutal that even some of the soldiers ordered to carry them out wrote letters home, expressing their horror and shame at what they were being forced to do. If what you're hearing right now contradicts everything you learned in school about Andrew Jackson, you're not alone. This is the history they don't teach. And if you want to understand how America's most celebrated leaders actually built their fortunes, hit that subscribe button now, because Jackson is just one of 4 founding fathers whose wealth came from sources far darker than the textbooks admit. Understanding how Andrew Jackson got rich means understanding that American populism and American brutality aren't opposites. They're partners. And the legacy of Jackson's wealth building through ethnic cleansing and human bondage still shapes the United States today in ways most Americans never learned about in school, ways that explain wealth gaps, land ownership patterns, and ongoing injustices that trace directly back to the Trail of Tears and the cotton plantations worked by people Jackson bought and sold like livestock. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767, in the Waxhaws region, straddling the border between North and South Carolina. into a world nothing like the plantation aristocracy that produced Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. His father died 3 weeks before he was born, leaving his mother Elizabeth struggling to survive as a poor widow with 3 young boys. There was no inheritance, no land, no enslaved people, no social standing, just poverty, hardship, and a world that offered poor families almost no path to prosperity. The Revolutionary War consumed Jackson's childhood and destroyed what little his family had. At 13, he joined the Continental Army as a courier, riding messages between units during brutal partisan warfare in the Carolinas. British soldiers captured him in 1781 and nearly killed him. When young Andrew refused to clean a British officer's boots, the officer slashed him across the face and hand with a sword, leaving scars Jackson carried for the rest of his life. His mother and 2 brothers all died during or because of the war from disease and hardship, leaving 14-year-old Andrew completely alone in the world with nothing. No family, no money, no prospects, just a burning rage against the circumstances that had left him powerless, and a willingness to do absolutely anything to claw his way out of poverty and ensure he would never be powerless again. That determination led Jackson to law, or at least to what passed for legal training on the frontier. He apprenticed with lawyers in North Carolina, absorbing just enough knowledge to pass the bar examination, and in 1788 headed west to the newly opened Tennessee Territory, where opportunity awaited anyone tough enough and ruthless enough to seize it. Jackson arrived in Nashville with almost nothing in his pockets, but he had what mattered most on the frontier: raw ambition, complete ruthlessness, and absolutely no moral hesitation about the methods he would use to build his fortune. Jackson started as a public prosecutor in Nashville, collecting fees from criminal cases he won and civil judgments he secured, but he quickly understood that law was just a doorway to real wealth, which in the 1790s Tennessee Territory meant 2 things, and only 2 things: land speculation and slave trading. The indigenous peoples who had lived in Tennessee for thousands of years, the Cherokee and Creek and Chickasaw nations, were being systematically driven out through a combination of military force, fraudulent treaties, and simple theft, backed by armed settlers. Their land was being parceled out to white settlers at dirt-cheap prices through a corrupt system of grants and sales. And enslaved people from the exhausted tobacco lands of Virginia and the Carolinas were being moved west to this fresh territory where cotton cultivation would soon make slavery more profitable than it had ever been. Jackson positioned himself at the center of both systems of exploitation. He acquired land through his legal connections, sometimes accepting parcels as payment for legal services, sometimes buying titles cheap through insider knowledge and selling them high to incoming settlers. And he entered the slave trade actively, not just buying people for his own use, but operating as a merchant in human flesh, trafficking human beings between markets for profit. This wasn't casual participation in an inherited system. Jackson was hustling, building his fortune through the most brutal commerce imaginable. The evidence of Jackson's slave trading appears in his own letters and account books that have survived. In the 1790s and early 1800s, Jackson corresponded regularly with business partners about shipments moving down the Mississippi River between Nashville and the slave markets of Natchez. Historical records document that these shipments included enslaved people. One letter from a business associate thanks Jackson for his help with what was cryptically called a little venture of swan skins, which historians now believe was coded language for a shipment of enslaved human beings, using slave-trading jargon designed to avoid putting explicit evidence in writing. Jackson was hustling for his fortune in the most brutal way possible, treating human beings as just another commodity to be bought cheap, transported downriver, and sold dear for maximum profit. In 1796, Jackson made the marriage that would transform his economic and social situation. He married Rachel Donaldson Robards, a woman from one of Tennessee's established frontier families. The Donaldsons weren't plantation aristocracy, but they had land, social standing throughout the territory, and connections to everyone who mattered in Nashville's small but growing elite. More importantly for Jackson's ambitions, the marriage gave him legitimacy. He was no longer just another poor lawyer, scrambling for business and trading in whatever would turn a profit. He was connected to people who controlled land and local politics, people who could help him rise. That same year, Jackson bought his first substantial property, 420 acres, from a friend and business partner, for a price that reflected Jackson's growing wealth as a lawyer and trader. He called it the Hermitage, naming it after a fashionable racetrack he admired. This initial purchase was modest by the standards of Virginia plantations, but it was a foundation Jackson could build on, and he understood perfectly that in the frontier South, you built wealth by acquiring land and forcing people to work it without compensation, accumulating the fruits of their labor year after year, while they received nothing beyond bare subsistence. Jackson started with just a handful of enslaved people working the Hermitage's fields. But his enslaved population grew steadily as his wealth increased and his ambitions expanded. In 1804, he purchased additional land that would become the core of his plantation. By 1812, he owned around 20 enslaved people. By 1820, that number had grown to 44. By the time he became president in 1829, Jackson enslaved 95 people at the Hermitage alone, not counting those he owned at other properties. When he died in 1845, 161 enslaved people were working his Tennessee plantations. Over his lifetime, accounting for births, deaths, and sales, the Jackson family enslaved at least 300 people, buying them, breeding them, selling them when cash was needed, working them from sunrise to sundown 6 days a week to build and sustain the fortune that made Andrew Jackson one of Tennessee's wealthiest men. The conditions at the Hermitage revealed Jackson's approach to slavery with brutal clarity. He wasn't a hands-off owner letting overseers handle everything. Jackson personally managed his plantation when he was home, wrote detailed instructions about work requirements when he was away, and maintain meticulous records tracking every enslaved person by name, age, family relationships, skills, and economic value. He organized his workforce with military efficiency, assigning field hands to cotton cultivation, skilled artisans to blacksmithing and carpentry, domestic servants to the main house, and he enforced discipline through the threat and reality of violence. Jackson's correspondence shows he ordered harsh punishment for enslaved people who disobeyed or resisted. Whipping was routine, expected, barely worth mentioning in most cases. But when he felt someone had stepped particularly out of line, Jackson made examples. When a woman he enslaved acted in a way Jackson considered disrespectful, putting on airs as he described it, he ordered her publicly whipped in front of the other enslaved workers as a warning. When enslaved people ran away seeking freedom, Jackson pursued them relentlessly, advertising rewards for their capture, demanding they be returned in chains, and ensuring they were punished severely enough that others would think twice before attempting escape. One of his letters complains about the death of an enslaved man at the Hermitage, but Jackson's concern was purely financial. He wrote to his overseer demanding a full account of your guardianship with the loss of my property. Not the loss of a human life, not a person who had died, the loss of property. That was how Jackson thought about the people whose stolen labor built his fortune. Archaeological excavations at the Hermitage have uncovered remnants of the slave quarters where families lived in conditions that make a mockery of any claim that slavery could be benevolent. The typical cabin was about 400 square feet, often housing multiple family members in a single room with minimal privacy or comfort. One small window, a fireplace for cooking and winter heat that filled the cramped space with smoke, a dirt floor. These people who worked from sunrise to sundown 6 days a week, growing the cotton that made Jackson rich, maintaining the mansion and grounds that impressed his political visitors, ensuring that Andrew Jackson could live like a gentleman while presenting himself publicly as a champion of ordinary working people, lived in conditions barely better than livestock. The contradiction was stark and deliberate. Jackson fought politically against what he called the corrupt elite, against Eastern bankers and aristocrats who he claimed oppressed honest farmers and workers. He positioned himself as the voice of the common man, the self-made hero who understood struggle because he had lived it. Yet he owned a large plantation worked by enslaved people who received nothing for their labor, who lived in desperate poverty while he accumulated wealth worth over $130 million in today's terms. Jackson's populism, his democracy, his common man rhetoric extended only to white men. Everyone else, black people and indigenous peoples, existed to be exploited for white prosperity. That wasn't a contradiction of his populism. For most of American history, that was populism, a politics that promised equality for some by taking everything from others. Jackson's political career began with Tennessee statehood in 1796, when he served briefly in Congress before returning home, finding national politics tedious and unprofitable compared to his Tennessee business interests. But it was the War of 1812 that transformed him from a regional figure into a national hero. Leading Tennessee militia and regular army troops, Jackson won decisive victories against Creek Indians, who had allied with the British, and against British regulars at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. The New Orleans victory, achieved 2 weeks after a peace treaty had been signed in Europe, but before news of that treaty reached the combatants, made Jackson famous throughout the United States. The rough frontiersman, who had defeated professional British soldiers in set-piece battle, became a symbol of American strength, courage, and the rough frontier virtue that was supposedly purer than the corrupted civilization of the East. But even Jackson's military glory was tangled inextricably with slavery and the dispossession of indigenous peoples. During the Creek War of 1813 to 1814, Jackson not only defeated Creek forces militarily, but also seized 23 million acres of their land in the Treaty of Fort Jackson, a treaty so one-sided and punishing that even Creek factions who had fought alongside Jackson lost their territory. This enormous land grab opened vast territories for white settlement and cotton cultivation, worked by enslaved laborers. It made Jackson and his friends and political allies enormously wealthy through land speculation, and it intensified the crisis over indigenous peoples still living in the Southeast. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations occupied millions of additional acres that white settlers wanted desperately. And Jackson, now a national hero with growing political ambitions, positioned himself as the man who would solve this problem permanently by removing indigenous peoples entirely from the Southeast. After the War of 1812, as Jackson's national reputation grew, he continued aggressively expanding his personal wealth at the Hermitage. The plantation evolved from a frontier farm to a substantial estate. A brick mansion replaced the original log cabin. Completed in 1821, with every brick made, every foundation stone laid, every wall built, every window installed, every detail crafted by enslaved workers, whose names appear in Jackson's records primarily as property to be valued and counted. In 1834, after a chimney fire severely damaged the house, enslaved workers rebuilt it in even grander form, creating the mansion that stands now as a national historic landmark, drawing thousands of tourists annually. That house, that beautiful example of early American architecture that visitors admire, was built entirely by enslaved people who lived in crude cabins behind it and whose stolen labor created every comfort Jackson enjoyed. Jackson also invested heavily in thoroughbred horses, breeding and racing them for substantial profits. His stallion Truxton earned over $20,000 in prize money and commanded stud fees of $30 per mare, enormous sums for the early 1800s. He diversified his agricultural production beyond cotton to include wheat, corn, and livestock. He operated a cotton gin on his property, processing not only his own crop, but his neighbors' crops for fees. Everything was designed to extract maximum profit from the land and from the enslaved labor that worked it. By the 1820s, Jackson ranked among Tennessee's wealthiest men, With extensive landholdings, a large enslaved workforce, and diverse investments that generated substantial annual income. But Jackson's greatest wealth wasn't merely in tangible assets like land and enslaved people. It was in political power that he could leverage into economic opportunity. His military fame and his carefully cultivated image as a man of the people gave him enormous influence. And in 1828, after losing the bitterly contested 1824 election in what he and his supporters called a corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, Jackson won the presidency decisively. He entered the White House in March 1829 as a hero to millions of Americans who saw him as their champion against the Eastern establishment, against privilege, against the corrupt elite. What they didn't see, or chose not to see, was the enslaved people Jackson brought with him to Washington to serve his household in the nation's capital. George, an enslaved man in his early 20s and the son of the Hermitage's cook, Old Hannah, became Jackson's personal manservant in the White House. He slept on a pallet on the floor of Jackson's bedroom, available at any hour, day or night, whenever the president needed him. George had no time off, no freedom to leave the White House grounds, no control over any aspect of his own life. He served Jackson faithfully for decades, attending to every personal need until Jackson's death in 1845. He stood at Jackson's bedside in those final moments. The decades of loyal service, if loyalty means anything when someone has no choice, earned George exactly nothing. He remained enslaved. Other enslaved people served in the president's house during Jackson's 8 years in office. They cooked the meals for elaborate state dinners where Jackson entertained congressmen, diplomats, and political allies. They maintained the household, ensuring the president's comfort while he governed the nation and made decisions affecting millions. Among them was Charles, who had served as Jackson's carriage driver at the Hermitage. Jackson separated Charles from his family by bringing him to Washington, while leaving his wife Charlotte and their children back in Tennessee. When someone later offered to buy Charlotte and reunite the family in Washington, Jackson wrote about potentially agreeing to the sale in terms that emphasized his own benevolence, completely ignoring that he had created the family separation in the first place by treating Charles as property to be moved wherever Jackson found it convenient. Jackson's presidency is remembered for several defining features. He fought the Second Bank of the United States, which he viewed as a corrupt institution serving wealthy elites at the expense of ordinary Americans. He championed expanded voting rights for white men, working to eliminate property requirements that had limited suffrage. He proclaimed himself the tribune of the common people against entrenched privilege. His supporters celebrated him as the first president who truly represented ordinary Americans rather than the established aristocracy. But Jackson's presidency is also remembered by those who know the full history that schools often gloss over for the Trail of Tears. The forced removal of tens of thousands of indigenous people from their ancestral lands in the Southeast, resulting in at least 4,000 deaths, and possibly as many as 8,000, along with the complete destruction of entire nations and ways of life. And that removal wasn't a tragic necessity or an unfortunate consequence of circumstances beyond anyone's control. It was a calculated policy that Jackson created, championed, and implemented, because removing indigenous peoples would make him and his supporters vastly richer by opening their lands for white settlement and cotton cultivation. And if you're wondering how we know all of this with such certainty, it's because Jackson left a paper trail. Letters, account books, official policies, all documented in his own hand. If these revelations about Jackson have changed how you see American history, take a moment to leave a like on this video and drop a comment telling us which part shocked you the most, because the story we're about to tell you about the Trail of Tears is even more brutal than what you've heard so far. The Indian Removal Act, which Jackson signed into law in May 1830, just over a year into his his presidency, authorized the president to negotiate treaties exchanging indigenous lands in the southeast for territory west of the Mississippi River. The law's language claimed the process would be voluntary, emphasizing negotiated treaties and willing relocation with compensation. But the reality from the beginning was coercion, fraud, and ultimately military force. Jackson and his administration applied enormous pressure on indigenous nations to sign removal treaties, often negotiating with minority factions rather than with legitimate tribal governments, ignoring established treaties that guaranteed indigenous land rights, and systematically undermining indigenous peoples' legal position through state laws that stripped them of protections. The Cherokee Nation fought removal through every available legal avenue. They had adapted extensively to American culture over preceding decades, creating a written language developed by Sequoyah, adopting a constitution modeled on the United States Constitution, establishing a republican form of government, building schools, publishing newspapers in Cherokee and English. They were literate, organized, sophisticated in their legal arguments. They argued they were a sovereign nation, protected by multiple treaties with the federal government. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia that Georgia had no authority to extend its laws over Cherokee territory, that only the federal government had jurisdiction over relations with indigenous nations. It was an unambiguous legal victory for the Cherokee, a clear statement from the nation's highest court that their rights must be respected. But Andrew Jackson simply ignored it. He is reported, though the exact quote may be apocryphal, to have said that Chief Justice John Marshall had made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Whether or not Jackson spoke those precise words, his actions made his position clear. He had absolutely no intention of protecting Cherokee rights against Georgia or against white settlers who wanted Cherokee land. The Supreme Court had no army to enforce its ruling. Jackson controlled the executive branch and its military forces, and he would use that power not to uphold the court's decision, but to facilitate Cherokee removal. In 1835, a small faction of Cherokee leaders, knowing that resistance was ultimately futile against the combined pressure of the federal government and Georgia, signed the Treaty of New Echota. This treaty agreed to exchange all Cherokee land in the southeast for territory in what would become Oklahoma, plus $5 million in compensation and support for relocation. The vast majority of Cherokee, led by Principal Chief John Ross, vehemently rejected this treaty as fraudulent. The faction that signed it, led by Major Ridge and his son John Ridge and Elias Boudinot, represented perhaps 500 Cherokee out of a population of 16,000. They had no authority under Cherokee law to negotiate such a treaty, no mandate from their people, no legitimacy in their actions. But the United States Senate ratified the treaty anyway by a single vote in May 1836, and the treaty became federal law despite its fraudulent origins. Cherokee people had until May 1838 to voluntarily relocate west. The deadline came. The vast majority remained in their homes, on their land, in their communities, believing rightly that the treaty was illegitimate and that their legal rights would ultimately be recognized. They were wrong. In May 1838, federal troops under General Winfield Scott and state militias from Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama began systematically rounding up Cherokee families at gunpoint. Soldiers burst into homes without warning, giving families mere minutes to gather a few possessions before being marched away at bayonet point. People were taken from their fields in the middle of planting crops, from their schools during lessons, from their churches during worship services. Families were separated in the chaos. Children lost track of parents. Elderly people were dragged from their beds. White settlers followed immediately behind the soldiers, moving into Cherokee homes before the families had even been marched out of sight, looting belongings, claiming land and property that by any moral standard still belonged to people being driven away at gunpoint. The detention camps where Cherokee families were held while removal was organized were scenes of horror. Families were packed into crude stockades, essentially open-air prisons with inadequate shelter, insufficient food and clean water, and no sanitation facilities. Disease spread rapidly through the crowded, filthy conditions. Dysentery, measles, whooping cough and other illnesses killed hundreds of people, particularly children and the elderly, before the westward journey even began. The conditions were so appalling that even some of the soldiers involved wrote letters home, expressing their shame and revulsion at what they were being ordered to do. One soldier later recalled that he fought in the Civil War and witnessed much bloodshed, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work he ever knew. Beginning in October 1838 and continuing through the winter into early 1839, Cherokee families were forced to march west in multiple detachments. The journey covered roughly 1,000 miles from their homelands in Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, through Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas, to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. The routes varied depending on which detachment and which time of year, but all involved months of travel in conditions that ranged from difficult to lethal. The marches took place during one of the coldest winters in recorded history up to that time. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Snow and ice covered the ground. People walked with inadequate clothing and shoes that quickly wore through. Many walked barefoot in the snow, leaving bloody tracks. The government contractors who had been paid to provide food, blankets, and supplies often failed to deliver or delivered spoiled food and worthless goods, pocketing the difference as profit. Families went hungry for days at a time, watching their children grow weak and sick. Disease continued spreading along the march. The same illnesses that had killed hundreds in the detention camps followed the detachments westward. Pneumonia, dysentery, and other conditions killed people every single day of the journey. Each detachment stopped for funerals and burials at nearly every camp. Families buried their loved ones in unmarked graves along roadsides, unable to observe proper Cherokee burial customs, denied even the dignity of traditional funeral ceremonies, forced to leave their dead behind and keep moving because the military escorts would not allow delays. The graves stretched along the trail for 1,000 miles, so many graves that the Cherokee began calling the route the Trail Where They Cried, which became known in English as the Trail of Tears. Of the approximately 16,000 Cherokee removed, at least 4,000 died during detention. The march and the difficult first years in unfamiliar territory, trying to rebuild communities and lives. Some scholarly estimates place the death toll even higher, reaching 8,000 or more when including those who died in the months and years after arrival from the trauma and disruption. That means 1/4 to 1/2 of the entire Cherokee nation perished because Andrew Jackson and the United States government wanted their land. 16,000 people forcibly removed, at least 4,000 dead, families destroyed, a nation shattered, an entire way of life deliberately obliterated, all so that white settlers could take Cherokee land and plant cotton worked by enslaved people. The Cherokee Trail of Tears is the most famous forced removal, the one that appears in textbooks when this history is taught at all. But it wasn't the only one. The Choctaw Nation had been removed earlier in the 1830s under similarly brutal conditions, marching west in winter weather with insufficient supplies, watching their people die along the way. The Creek were forcibly removed after a brief, desperate resistance in 1836, driven west at gunpoint. The Chickasaw negotiated slightly better terms and managed their own removal with somewhat less loss of life, but they still lost their homeland, still faced the trauma of leaving everything they knew, still arrived in unfamiliar territory, having to rebuild from nothing. The Seminole fought the longest, most expensive war in American history up to that time, rather than submit to removal. But most were eventually forced to Indian Territory, though a remnant managed to stay in Florida's swamps where the army couldn't reach them. In total, Jackson's Indian removal policy displaced approximately 50,000 indigenous people from the South. southeast and opened approximately 25 million acres to white settlement and enslavement agriculture. The brutality was not accidental or unintended. It was the predictable, foreseeable result of policies Jackson deliberately chose. Military force at gunpoint, detention in prison camps, forced marches during the coldest winter in memory with inadequate supplies. Jackson and his administration knew people would die. They knew children would starve and freeze. They knew elderly people couldn't survive such conditions. They chose to proceed anyway, because getting indigenous peoples off their land mattered more than indigenous people's lives. Jackson claimed publicly that he wanted to protect indigenous peoples by moving them away from white settlers who threatened them. He described removal as benevolent, as a humanitarian measure that would save indigenous peoples from inevitable destruction if they remained. But this paternalistic language was transparent propaganda designed to mask the reality. Indigenous peoples weren't threatened by some abstract natural force or inevitable historical tide. They were threatened by white Americans who wanted their land and who had the political and military power to take it. And rather than protect indigenous rights against white aggression, rather than enforce existing treaties, rather than use federal authority to prevent states like Georgia from violating indigenous sovereignty, Jackson chose to remove indigenous peoples entirely, clearing the land for white settlement and opening the territories for cotton cultivation and maximum wealth extraction. The connection between Jackson's personal fortune and Indian removal was direct and undeniable. The land Jackson had seized during the Creek War in 1814 became prime cotton-growing territory that made him and his allies wealthy. The Cherokee lands that he forced the nation to vacate contained gold deposits that white miners immediately and enthusiastically exploited. The territories opened by removal across the entire Southeast became the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, where slavery would reach its most intensive and profitable form, where cotton production would fuel the entire American economy and make the United States the dominant cotton producer for global textile manufacturing. Every acre cleared of indigenous peoples was an acre available for white settlement and enslaved cultivation. Jackson personally benefited from the system he created through his own expanding land and slave holdings. His friends and political allies, the men who helped elect him and whom he rewarded with appointments and opportunities, benefited enormously. And the Democratic Party political machine that Jackson built became the dominant force in American politics for a generation, partly because it could reward supporters with opportunities to profit from removed indigenous lands. Jackson's defenders, both in his own time and among some historians today, argue that removal was inevitable, that indigenous peoples couldn't possibly coexist with expanding white settlement, that Jackson was simply dealing with political realities beyond any one person's control, that he actually showed relative restraint compared to what might have happened if indigenous peoples had stayed and faced uncontrolled white violence. Every part of this argument collapses under scrutiny. Removal was not inevitable. It was a choice. The Supreme Court ruled that indigenous peoples had legal rights that states couldn't violate. Jackson chose to ignore that ruling. Cherokee people had successfully adapted to American culture, had adopted American economic practices and political structures, had demonstrated they could live peacefully alongside white settlers. Jackson chose to remove them anyway, because white settlers wanted the land more than they wanted peaceful coexistence. The deaths of at least 4,000 people during forced marches weren't accidental or unforeseeable. They were the predictable, obvious result of forcing thousands of people to march 1,000 miles during winter with inadequate supplies. Jackson and his administration knew people would die. They proceeded anyway, because the land and the wealth it represented mattered more than indigenous lives. Some scholars describe Jackson's Indian removal policy as genocide, fitting the definition of deliberately destroying a national, ethnic, or cultural group in whole or in part. They point to the intentional destruction of indigenous peoples' way of life, the forced displacement that shattered communities and cultures that had existed for thousands of years, the death toll that eliminated a significant portion of entire nations. Other scholars argue that genocide requires specific intent to destroy a people as such, which Jackson never explicitly stated. The debate over terminology continues, but whether or not the precise legal term genocide applies, the moral reality is absolutely clear. Jackson orchestrated policies that killed thousands of indigenous people, that destroyed their nations, that eliminated their way of life, that erased them from their ancestral lands. And he did it deliberately, knowingly, for profit, to transfer indigenous land and resources to white Americans, to open territories for cotton cultivation worked by enslaved people, to build wealth for himself and his supporters. That's not a complicated legacy requiring careful nuance. That's mass death for economic gain. While orchestrating genocide and accumulating his fortune from slavery, Jackson simultaneously cultivated his image as the champion of ordinary Americans. His war against the Second Bank of the United States consumed much of his presidency, dominating his second term. Jackson portrayed the bank as a corrupt institution that served wealthy elites, particularly Eastern bankers and merchants, at the expense of honest farmers and workers. He vetoed the bank's recharter in 1832, arguing that it concentrated too much economic power in the hands of the few, that it manipulated currency to benefit the rich, that it was fundamentally un-American in its aristocratic character. His supporters celebrated this fight as proof that Jackson truly represented the common man against entrenched privilege. Jackson's rhetoric emphasized democracy, equality for white men, expansion of voting rights, and hostility to concentrated power and inherited privilege. His supporters, who called themselves Jacksonian Democrats, praised him as the first president who truly represented ordinary people rather than the educated elite. They celebrated his rough frontier background, his lack of formal education, his direct manner, his willingness to fight against institutions and individuals he viewed as corrupt. The opening of the White House to ordinary citizens on Jackson's inauguration day, when thousands of common people flooded into the mansion and nearly destroyed it in their enthusiasm, became a symbol of his democratic spirit. But Jackson's populism was always selective, always limited, always built on exclusion that made it possible. It extended to white men, particularly white men who supported him politically and who could benefit from his policies of Indian removal and slavery protection. It emphatically did not extend to enslaved people working his plantation or to indigenous peoples whose land he wanted. Jackson's democracy was built on defining the people as white and male and defining everyone else as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited for white prosperity. That's not a contradiction of his populism or a failure to live up to his ideals. For most of American history, that was what populism meant, a politics that promised equality and opportunity for some by systematically taking land, labor, and life from others. Jackson's presidency ended in March 1837 when he handed power to his chosen successor Martin Van Buren, but his political influence continued shaping American government for decades. He had transformed American politics, breaking the power of the old establishment and creating a new Democratic Party built on his personal popularity and his populist rhetoric. He had opened politics to a broader white male electorate and had created a political machine that would dominate national government until the Civil War. He had also left behind policies that would take years to fully implement. The final Cherokee removal happened under Van Buren in 1838. Other removals continued into the 1840s, and the territories Jackson had cleared of indigenous peoples filled rapidly with white settlers and enslaved workers, fueling the expansion of slavery that would eventually tear the nation apart. Jackson returned to the Hermitage in retirement, living as a gentleman planter surrounded by enslaved people whose labor supported his comfortable existence. He corresponded with political allies and advised younger democratic leaders. He maintained his position as an elder statesman whose opinions carried weight, but his final years were also marked by serious financial troubles. His adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr., whom he had left in charge of the Hermitage during his long absences in Washington, had badly mismanaged the plantation's finances, accumulating substantial debts through poor decisions and possibly through gambling and speculation. The debts threatened to consume the estate. Jackson had to borrow money from political supporters to keep the Hermitage operating and to maintain the standard of living befitting a former president. The fortune he had built through decades of slave trading, plantation agriculture, land speculation, and political connections was dissolving through mismanagement, poor investments, and the inherent economic instability of a system built on forced labor. Andrew Jackson died on June 8, 1845, at age 78, surrounded by family and enslaved people at the Hermitage. His death was mourned throughout the nation as the passing of an era and the loss of a great American hero. His will left the Hermitage and its 161 enslaved people to Andrew Jackson Jr., who would continue struggling with debt and would eventually have to sell portions of the estate to stay afloat. Jackson's will made no provision for freeing any enslaved people. The man who had claimed to champion equality and democracy died maintaining absolute ownership of human beings, treating them as assets to be distributed among heirs like furniture or livestock. George, the enslaved man who had served Jackson personally for decades, who had slept on the floor of Jackson's bedroom in the White House available at any hour, who had attended to Jackson's needs through his presidency and retirement, who stood at Jackson's bedside when he died, inherited nothing from Jackson except continued enslavement. After decades of forced service, George remained the property of the Jackson family. Old Hannah, George's mother, who had cooked for the Jacksons for decades, who had prepared countless meals that fed Jackson and his political allies as they shaped the nation, remained enslaved to the family until the Civil War and the 13th Amendment finally ended slavery in Tennessee, giving her freedom when she was too old to fully enjoy it. The enslaved people of the Hermitage were gradually sold off or distributed over the following years to settle Andrew Jackson Jr.'s mounting debts. Some remained at the property as the Jackson family's financial situation worsened. When the Civil War finally ended slavery in 1865, 20 years after Jackson's death, those who had survived were finally free. But they received no compensation for lifetimes of stolen labor, no land from the plantation they had built and maintained, no resources to start independent lives. They walked away with only their freedom, expected to survive in a society that had been deliberately structured to exploit them and that would continue finding new ways to deny them opportunity for another century. The Cherokee and other removed nations struggled desperately to rebuild in Indian Territory. The deaths continued even after the Trail of Tears officially ended, as communities tried to establish themselves in unfamiliar land with inadequate resources and support. The trauma of removal, the destruction of traditional ways of life, the loss of sacred ancestral lands, all of this shaped indigenous experiences for generations and continues affecting their descendants today. The territories the government promised would belong to removed nations forever, that were supposedly compensation for lands stolen in the southeast, were gradually taken away as white settlement pushed ever westward. By the end of the 19th century, even Indian Territory itself was being systematically dismantled, its lands distributed to white settlers through the Dawes Act, and the land runs that opened Oklahoma to settlement. The promises made during removal were revealed as lies. The compensation was stolen. The safe haven turned out to be just another way station on an ongoing process of dispossession that has never really ended. Jackson's wealth at its peak approached $132 million in today's terms, though estimates vary significantly depending on how land values and enslaved people as capital assets are calculated. He owned over 1,000 acres at the Hermitage alone, with additional properties scattered across Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama. He enslaved over 300 people during his lifetime, buying them, breeding them, selling them, working them until they died or were too old to be productive. That fortune came from slave trading in the Mississippi River Valley, from plantation agriculture worked entirely by enslaved people who received nothing for their labor, from land speculation that depended on indigenous peoples being violently driven from their homes, and from political power that Jackson leveraged ruthlessly to enrich himself and his supporters. If Jackson had been required to pay wages to the people who worked his land, even at the lowest rates common for agricultural labor, he would never have become wealthy. If he hadn't been able to buy and sell human beings for profit, he would have remained a struggling frontier lawyer. If indigenous peoples had retained their ancestral lands instead of being driven out at gunpoint so white settlers could take their place, Jackson wouldn't have had access to the territories that made cotton cultivation profitable on the scale that built his fortune. Every dollar of his wealth depended fundamentally on systems of exploitation that treated some human beings as property and treated entire nations as obstacles to be eliminated for profit. Understanding Jackson's path to riches means understanding that American populism has always had this dark underside, this violent exclusion that makes the inclusion possible. The rhetoric of championing ordinary people, of fighting corrupt elites, of expanding democracy and opportunity, all of this can coexist with, and even depend on, brutal exploitation of those defined as outside the community of people who matter. Jackson's democracy was absolutely real for white men who supported him. It opened political participation. It challenged some forms of concentrated power. It created genuine opportunities for people who had been excluded from politics by property requirements and social class. But that same democracy was catastrophic for everyone Jackson and his supporters defined as other. For enslaved people, it meant continued bondage, expanding cotton cultivation, growing wealth for enslavers built on intensifying exploitation. For indigenous peoples, it meant forced removal, thousands of deaths, the destruction of entire nations and ways of life. Jackson's wealth came directly from their suffering. His political success depended on their elimination or subordination. The wealth gap between white and black Americans today traces directly back to slavery and to the century of systematic discrimination that followed emancipation. Enslaved people created enormous wealth that they never benefited from, wealth that was inherited by enslavers' descendants, while enslaved people's descendants started from nothing. The Homestead Act and other land distribution programs that built white wealth excluded black Americans. Redlining and discriminatory lending prevented wealth accumulation through home ownership. Employment discrimination, educational inequality, mass incarceration, all of these continue patterns that slavery established. Jackson's fortune was built on this system, and though his personal wealth dissolved within a generation, the structures that made it possible persisted and evolved. The poverty on many Native American reservations connects directly to forced removal and the ongoing failure to honor treaty obligations. The lands that were supposed to compensate for lands stolen in the Southeast were themselves stolen. The resources that were promised were never delivered. The sovereignty that treaties recognized was systematically violated. Economic development has been hindered by the legacy of removal, by the loss of traditional lands and resources, by policies designed to break up tribal landholding and assimilate indigenous peoples into white society. The Trail of Tears wasn't a single event in the 1830s. It was the beginning of an ongoing process of dispossession whose effects compound across generations. More than 175 years after Jackson's death, Americans are finally beginning to reckon more honestly with his full legacy. The decision to remove Jackson from the $20 bill in favor of Harriet Tubman, though announced years ago and still not implemented, reflects growing recognition that celebrating Jackson as an American hero requires ignoring too much of what he actually did. Archaeological work at the Hermitage has uncovered the material reality of enslaved people's lives, making their stories part of the site's historical interpretation rather than a footnote. Cherokee and other indigenous peoples have worked tirelessly to ensure that removal history is told accurately, that the Trail of Tears is understood not as an inevitable tragedy, but as a deliberate policy choice that killed thousands for profit. But Jackson's mythology persists stubbornly. He's still taught in many schools, primarily as a democratic hero who opened politics to ordinary Americans. His military victories are celebrated without adequate context about what those victories meant for the people he defeated and displaced. His populist rhetoric is quoted approvingly by politicians across the political spectrum who see him as a model for channeling popular anger against elites. The uncomfortable parts of his legacy, the active slave trading and the genocide, are often presented as unfortunate aspects of his time rather than as central to understanding who he was and how he built his wealth and power. We want desperately to believe that American heroes can be celebrated without confronting their crimes. Jackson's life proves that belief is a fantasy. So when you see Andrew Jackson's face on a $20 bill, remember the 300 people he enslaved, many of whom he bought and sold as a trader in human flesh. When you hear someone praise him as a man of the people, ask which people counted in his vision and which people he was willing to kill for profit. When you read about the Trail of Tears in a textbook that calls it a tragic chapter in American history, understand it wasn't a tragedy that happened to Jackson. It was a policy he created, championed, and implemented, because forcing indigenous peoples from their land would make him and white settlers richer. When someone calls him a champion of democracy, remember that his democracy was built on the explicit exclusion and violent elimination of everyone who wasn't a white man who supported him politically. Because Andrew Jackson's path to riches was far darker than we realized. It was built on slave trading, on buying and selling human beings for profit in Mississippi River markets. It was built on plantation agriculture, worked by people he owned, people he beat when they disobeyed, people he hunted down when they sought freedom. It was built on genocide, on policies that killed at least 4,000 Cherokee people and possibly twice that many, on the deliberate destruction of entire nations to clear land for white settlement and cotton cultivation. It was built on a populism that promised equality for some, by taking everything, including life itself, from others. The contradictions weren't accidental or unfortunate products of a difficult time. They were deliberate. They were the plan. They were how Jackson built his fortune and his political power. And understanding that truth, teaching it honestly, reckoning with its ongoing consequences, that's the only way forward for a nation still living with the legacy of wealth built on stolen lives and stolen land, still shaped by systems that Jackson helped create and strengthen, still struggling with inequalities that trace directly back to the Trail of Tears and the cotton plantations that Jackson's policies made profitable. If this story has changed how you see the $20 bill in your wallet, you're not alone. Thousands of people are finally learning the truth about how America's celebrated leaders actually built their fortunes. Leave a like if you think this history should be taught in every school. Subscribe, because we have 3 more founding fathers whose paths to riches were just as dark. Washington, Jefferson, and Madison all built fortunes on systems you won't believe. And comment below, should Andrew Jackson still be on the $20 bill, or is it time America faced the truth about its populist hero? Your voice matters in this conversation, and we read every single comment.